Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast, is supported by a generous grant from the North Dakota Natural Resources Trust. If you would like to contribute to our on-the-ground conservation initiatives and our conservation internship and mentorship programs here in North Dakota, please consider making a donation to us through our member support link on our Spotify page. Your contributions will directly support the Walsh County Three Rivers Soil Conservation District, where this year we will plant over 10,000 trees and several hundred acres of conservation grass, pollinators, and cover crops, while also offering hands-on conservation job training to our high school and college interns. You can also support our efforts by liking, reviewing, sharing, and subscribing to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Thank you. Welcome to Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast. Today's episode comes on the heels of a water quality crisis here in Walsh County, stemming from our most recent blue-green algae blooms. I joined our crew at the lake to collect the samples, and the scene was alarming. We backed the boat into the water. Toxic algae bloomed along the shoreline. A thick skin of bluish-green foam gurgled on the surface. Near the sandbars, streaks of neon green swirled in the water like northern lights. A kettle of turkey vultures huddled in the gloom by the swim beach. A pair of pelicans disappeared into the fog. The spillway, a quarter-mile from the dock, washed out in the haze, its shape held like a distant memory. The North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality set the reporting limit for microcystin at 8 micrograms per liter. Above 8 micrograms per liter, the dangerous toxin can kill a full-grown cow and cross the blood-brain barrier in humans. The last water sample we collected at Hami Dam contained 29,300 micrograms per liter, over 3,500 times the reporting limit, the highest recorded levels in the state. The cause of these alarming numbers is farm runoff. The chemical fertilizers, such as phosphorus, that erode into our lakes and rivers. In today's episode, we ask how can restoring prairie ecosystems help us to restore water quality while also providing viable economic opportunities for rural farm and ranch communities. To dig into these questions, we talk with John Devries and Patrice Delaney of the United Prairie Foundation. Originally founded in 2004 as Save the Hens, the United Prairie Foundation changed their name to better capture their mission, saving not only wetland bird habitat in the prairie pothole region of eastern North Dakota and western Minnesota, but to, quote, make prairie common again. In fact, the United Prairie Foundation recently trademarked the phrase, make prairie common again, and as you will hear, their dedicated team is committed to this effort, despite the odds. The prairies of eastern North Dakota and western Minnesota have been almost entirely replaced by monocrop agriculture and invasive grasses common to the American lawn, such as Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome. In their effort to make prairie common again, the United Prairie Foundation collects seeds from ditches and remnant prairies and develops working lands approaches to prairie management with local ranchers. When I spoke with them in January, they had 108 species of locally sourced native plants for several prairie restoration projects. Their dedication to collecting native plants from the local ecoregion and working with ranchers and local communities to manage restored prairies makes the United Prairie Foundation truly unique in the Great Plains. To date, they have helped to restore thousands of acres of native prairie and to manage prairies with prescribed and controlled burns. As they will repeat throughout today's episode, no fire, no prairie. Although wildfires have become a common threat throughout the American West and Canada, this episode features an in-depth conversation about why fire is so essential to prairie restoration and how local communities can adopt fire protocols for managing controlled burns on prairie landscapes. Fire was one of the central themes at the United Prairie Foundation's annual Prairie Festival, which I attended this summer. As one keynote speaker explained, quote, "Fire is not merely a tool for prairie restoration, it is an essential element. Fire is as important to the prairie as rain." As you will hear in today's episode, founder John Devries and biologist Patrice Delaney are unique voices in the conservation landscape with an ambitious vision to make prairie common again. Patrice is also an accomplished artist with artwork as wide-ranging as the prairie, from scientific drawings of prairie plants to an illustrated children's book titled Under Mother Tree, available for purchase on Amazon. We are very excited to share this in-depth and wide-ranging conversation with you. So without further ado, let's start the show.
So what we are is we're United Prairie Foundation, and we grow local eco-type prairie plants. So a lot of what we do is propagate plants under lights. This year we've ramped up a little bit to expand our footprint on growing certain species that we can grow this time of the year and put into dormancy to plant early in the spring. That way we can we go put some of these plants as greenhouse grown plants outside when the ground is still 3/4 away frozen. It just doesn't work. So prairie plants, majority of them are perennial. So we're basically growing the first year growth under lights. And then we'll insert the plants into the landscapes early in the spring, allowing the plants to actually achieve their second year growth in their first year in the field. So that's what we do in here. And we do a lot under lights is just checking our seed germination on our greenhouse seed. So we do certain things like germination of these smooth blue asters. We have a couple different seed lots in there so we can see the germination rate to know that we have to prep other seed for greenhouse production this year. All our seed that we use in field operation is tested through South Dakota State University in a large seed test. So this year we have 108 species, and they're all locally sourced, pick seed. Patrice inventories them and puts them on spreadsheets, so we have that. They're all the germination codes. To get a prairie seed to germinate, it needs to go through a, what am I trying to say, Patrice?
Stratification.
Right, through a stratification period, and so they all vary in what it takes to make a seed germinate. So this time of the year we do in this facility is we do that. We have a cold storage in the back that seed's stored in, and that's really our goal through the winter time with the growing of plants.
So who goes out and collects the seed, or how do you do that?
We all do, yeah.
So you're like a seed hunter? You
Yep.
go out and...
John's been doing it for how long?
Yeah, quite a long time, right? Teresa's, our whole team does. We at times have 7, 8, 10 people out helping us gather seed.
And is that happening kind of throughout spring, summer, fall, depending on, when things go to seed, right? Yeah.
Right, just like the different germination codes to germinate the seed becomes finished at different periods of time. Real similar to agriculture. Corn is later, soybeans earlier, wheat's earlier. The prairie seeds are real similar to that. There's the early spring plants, some will be done early, some will be, through the whole period of the year, just like you had referenced. Exactly. What we were founded for was to aid prairie pothole region breeding waterfowl. And that's still our mission. We don't work outside of the prairie pothole region. It's just when you look at the the methods of aiding the creatures, we were founded to be an implementation group. We actually do work. We weren't a chapter-based group. We're a club-based group where we're not trying to establish chapters throughout the U.S. We have clubs that help and manage and do things for us and partner with us. So it was really put to be an implementation group to aid prairie pothole breeding waterfowl. But when you look at the scope of things, the prairie is so jeopardized, wounded, deteriorated, gone, right, Patrice?
Yep.
It's gone, right?
Kinda, yeah.
Right, kinda, yeah. So, so we've changed our methods a little bit in doing it. We've done in the past predator management, nesting structures, yada yada. Some groups still do those, but really to impact the greatest number of creatures, restoring the real local ecotype prairie ecosystem is what we did. And that's when we changed our name to United Prairie Foundation, because that's what we do. We do prairie and in the zone of western Minnesota, eastern North Dakota. So when you do that, you're benefiting all grassland birds. Monarchs are a big benefit of ours. We lost some sponsors in Louisiana because they don't eat monarch gumbo, you know, because we're a duck organization, but they just can't pick up on how, you know, raising milk, you know, having diverse ecosystems that grow everything that was on the prairie, helping monarchs helps our ducks. Skunks are a major predator of bird eggs. Skunks are an insectivorous animal. They'd rather eat bugs. But when they're in a destroyed ecosystem, there's very little food for a duck or for a skunk to eat. So they're forced to eat bird eggs. And same with raccoons. The habitat's so screwed up that their numbers are, you know, they were not really a prairie animal. Now they're pretty dominant on the prairie and they're aggressive. They eat a lot of food. So, you know, having more diverse habitats creates more space for everyone.
Up in Walsh County, where I come from, we have, of course, the Red River Valley, which gets a lot of attention for its monocrop production, agriculture, but we also have a really diverse soil map in that we have the prairie pothole region to the west. And so can you tell us a little bit more about what is the prairie pothole region?
Well, the prairie pothole region was, you know, was established through the glaciers retreating, gouging out all the little prairie potholes. Prairie potholes are just small depressions in the earth that are a lot of them, well, a vast majority of them would be seasonally wet. So they would dry up in the summer. The plant communities that would be in them would be great. Those are the ones that are probably most jeopardized. They're so easily converted to ag, drained, that now we're getting more and more of the larger prairie potholes, but that was it during the, you know, like the Red River Basin was Lake Agassiz watershed. It was a lake. Outside of that region, it was the prairie pothole regions, and then I don't know, Patrice would probably know more on this one, but like Lakes Country, you know, how that's a different ecosystem. The drainage, it's on a lot of people, so if she was thinking on my lines, she would say what I'm saying is the drainage, like you get into Fergus Falls and you get east of Fergus Falls, the drainage goes into the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. You get over here, it goes into the Red River, which goes north into Lake Winnipeg and through that region. So it's a drastic line in the sand almost. So the prairie pothole region is a narrow band that goes up through Iowa, a little bit through South Dakota, North Dakota, western Minnesota, and up into Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta. And it's a large area in Canada. North Dakota occupies a large part of the prairie pothole region, and they're really, they'd be just wetland-based, mixed grass prairie, you know, prairie-based habitats that raised, you know, they call it the duck factory. And so our mission is to help return that as making a phrase that we've trademark that we're launching this year is making prairie common again. And that's really our goal, because the more prairie, the more ducks, the more birds, and the more meadowlarks, our state bird. These birds are prairie grass or prairie habitat dependent. So you remove the prairie habitat and you have all these non-native invasive European grasses dominating the landscape, your native birds disappear. And the grassland birds they're really hurt. They need our help. They need a concerted effort from conservation. And our saying always is, if not us, who? If the people that are in charge of the managing the natural resources don't do the right thing and utilize real prairie seed and make an effort to do authentic prairie restorations, the future doesn't look bright. But people on the outside depend on us. So that's where we come back. If not us, who? The key is just doing the restoration all through the concept of it. The tree removal, the local ecotype prairie being planted, is all helping prairie. Prairie's being very unmanaged right now. What would you say, Patrice, on what would be the biggest thing you could add?
Fire.
Right, fire. Right, no fire, no prairie.
Yeah.
That's a fact of life, you know. So the culture is no fire. That's what when this country was founded, it was founded by European settlers. They wanted it to look like Europe, the tree species, the grass. It's got to be green in the spring. They didn't realize that the diverse plant communities that were growing, that would, you know, look at how many buffalo we sustained, and they didn't die of starvation, you know. So raising some cows on that land, it was just the knowledge of the settlers didn't know that. They wanted to emulate what their environment was where they came from. They didn't know any better. I mean, you get on a ship, you come over to the New World, and you go to restore, you know, you're living on your property and everything that is a North American tall grass prairie, and you're scratching your head wondering about what your cows are going to eat. It looks all dormant and dead, when in reality it isn't. It's full of protein and good food, and it's a diverse community that's going to grow throughout the whole year. But they didn't know this. They brought over brome, Kentucky bluegrass, and made a huge effort to repopulate the whole area into those species. And what, you know, we say a lot on that is great-grandpa would be so proud now. The whole environment is Kentucky bluegrass and brome, sort of his vision from day one. But he didn't realize, like in North Dakota, when it gets 104 degrees in July, and all of a sudden, like, Kentucky bluegrass needs a lot of cool, dry, moist environment to live, that you start droughting out these crops. And what do your cows eat when your whole environment are these cool season European crops, right? So they basically got what they wanted, but that's what's ruined a lot of our prairies, are these non-native grasses, for the most part, invading.
So right here we have a bunch of our plants germinating and growing. So something that we do is we will solid seed a flat tray with one species. This one is Meadow Liatris. There are some bergamot growing out of there, which are fine. But these will eventually be snipped and put into dormancy, and then we will use their corms. They produce like a small corm, kind of like a lily or something like that. Let's see. I mean, we have a lot of species growing here. There are probably like 50 or so, probably at least 50 species that we have growing here already. It looks like just a lot of grass, but all this grass-looking stuff is the Meadow Liatris and Prairie Liatris, which is the favorite of monarch butterflies as they migrate south in the fall. At United Prairie Foundation, I sort of function as a biologist, a communicator, a seed collector, kind of have every role here as an implementation group for prairie restoration. As the only native plant nursery in North Dakota, we really operate between western Minnesota tallgrass prairie and eastern North Dakota tallgrass prairie. and then through the prairie pothole region of North Dakota. And most of our greenhouse seed comes from native wild sites that we have permission to pick on, or they come out of prairies that we've planted and then can collect seed from. And we're very, very strict on our origin of our seed because we believe that in order to make prairie common again, which is our new mission statement, we need to be using real, native, local seed and high diverse seed at that.
So can you give us a kind of example of what it's like when you are going out into the field? Because you like are a seed hunter, right? You go out into the field, you're collecting seeds. So what does a day in the life of that part of the season look like?
Well, this is really actually my first season doing it. So this season, I guess just like a typical day out there, we'll go to a prairie either on private land in North Dakota or public land in Minnesota that we have permission to get seed from. What that might look like is getting out of my car, walking through the ditch in the cattails, and then up the hill to where the native plants are that we're targeting. And we hand pick, so we have to wear gloves or use snippers to collect seeds quickly. And then we have a bag that we strap to us with a belt or a rope. And we use a bag because as you're walking through the plants, if you're coming across weeds, you can close your bag so the weed seeds don't fall in. For example, if you're walking through a brome field that has some really nice smooth blue asters, you don't want that brome grass in there. You just want to be able to get your aster seed.
Cold stratification, can you describe what that is and why it's important?
Yeah, so it's all about breaking the seed's dormancy. And that could be because they have, maybe they have a really hard coat on their seed that needs to kind of be just broken down over time.
What are you guys up to in the winter? And then what does spring, summer, fall bring when you're working here?
Well, right now, as you can see behind me, we are starting to grow our plants from seed. The seed that isn't ready to grow yet needs to be cold stratified for 10 to 120 days, depending on the species. So I'm kind of in the process of sorting through the seed right now and starting to mix it with moist vermiculite and putting it into the cold storage to be taken out in a month or two to be grown again. Another thing that can be done in the winter is tree removal on uplands. Invasive trees would be like cedars, ash, which is native, but native trees aren't supposed to really be in the grasslands. That's why they're prairie. Also in the winter, we can do snow seeding. We plant restorations in the snow because the seed can then melt into the snow and then stick really hard in there. And that best replicates how nature does it too. In the winter, we also spend a lot of time with programs, planning what we're going to do in the spring and summer and developing those programs down to every last little detail.
So what inspired you to begin working with prairie plants, and what continues to inspire you today?
Yeah, so it all started in 2018 when I started attending college at MSUM, Minnesota State University, Moorhead. I worked with Dr. Allison Wallace on prairie research from pretty much my first week there. She put out a call to students that wanted to volunteer for research, and I jumped on it right away to get in the field. I didn't realize you could go do stuff like that in college, so I jumped on it right away. And I never really left the prairie after that.
So I'm really fascinated by your background in science illustration. And so just a little bit of background here. I interviewed Dr. Allison Wallace, and she told me about you and your work in science illustration and told me I had to talk to Patrice about her work as a science illustrator. So I'm curious for you, how does your artistic eye interact with your scientific eye? Or in other words, can you describe how you have learned to see the prairie both through art and through science?
Yeah, well, I see them as kind of the same thing, which almost ties into spirituality for me in a way, but I'll maybe not go there right now. But I have known for a long time that I've always wanted to combine art and nature in my career to make the environment better. And it comes out in different media and in different ecosystems. So one of the first prairie plants I learned was prairie smoke. It's one of the first plants to bloom in the spring, just after the snow has melted. And so that plant really was like the starting point for me in prairie, because I was assigned that plant in a drawing class, and at first I was like, I don't like this plant, I want a different one. And then as I learned about it, I just became fascinated with it, and now I go see it bloom every spring. And this will be year 5 of doing that this spring. So that was my first real scientific illustration project of a prairie plant. After that, as my final project at MSUM with the scientific illustration program, I made a field guide that was meant to be used for my peers in the prairie research department. There's a little more here. Also, I used to work at a soil and water conservation district in Pennington County in Minnesota. And so I distributed that field guide there as part of the county fair booth that they had. I also pushed a lot of art on that office. They had a native grass display that was framed, and they let me paint a landscape behind the native grasses. I also collected, pressed, and framed, I think it was like 6 or 8 native flowers for their office. So it looked really, really nice. And then they could learn some of the plants that are out there. I also, aside from prairie, I've also done art with the forest too. So before I was working with John here, I was working at the City of Moorhead Forestry Division for 2 years, where I incorporated a lot of art into that. I did a short scientific illustration class with an art teacher, or an art class. I think they were 3rd grade in Moorhead. So that was an introduction to emerald ash borer, which is an invasive beetle that kills ash trees. Outside of working at the city, I also built 3 sculptures of animals from branches that I installed in a park in the forest to get people to go out into the woods, or to get people who are already out there to notice the art. So I've always really wanted to combine the two. And currently I'm illustrating a children's book that is being authored by my aunt, Mary Delaney. And it covers the topic of mother trees and mycelium networks. It's called Under Mother Tree, and it'll be published this year.
What's your favorite prairie plant to illustrate when you're wearing your artist hat? And I guess you said that these are sort of combined, but what's your favorite prairie plant to observe as a biologist?
Okay, that's a good question. And it's really hard to answer because just thinking of the 100 species that we have here, how do you pick one favorite? But as an artist, and as just a North Dakota resident, I think the prairie rose is a really nice muse because it's simple to draw, but it's very complex in the leaves and the thorns and everything else about it. The colors of it are very diverse. It can range from white to a hot pink flower. The leaves themselves change throughout the season. They turn red just like a maple tree would. So they add a lot of color in the fall. Its red rose hips also add intense color on a dormant prairie. And lastly, it's one of the few native forbs that's still common in North Dakota, even where invasive grasses are dominant. So for me, it's kind of a symbol that our prairie is under there somewhere. It's out there. It's kind of gone, It's just about really, really gone, but there are some roses out there. And I think that can be a symbol of hope. As a biologist, I'm going to say it's going to be Anise hyssop. The scientific name of that is, forgive my pronunciation, Agastache funiculum. It's one of my favorites because it's always buzzing with bees. It grows really big and the bees are constantly on it. It also smells like black licorice when crushed. As a biologist, that's interesting because it's not the same plant that black licorice comes from. It's not even related, but it's related to mints. So bergamot, mountain mint, Canada mint, and the hyssop are all aromatic, but they have completely different smells, but they're all part of the mint family. So as a scientist, learning the evolutionary connections makes prairie a lot more meaningful and interesting.
I guess in your words, how can combining art and science help others to gain a greater understanding and appreciation of the prairie?
I think a really big part of it is creating familiarity, which I think that the exhibit at the Plains does really well. So you're forced to walk through the hallway with the plants lining either side, and whether you pay close attention or not, you're being exposed to those images of the native plants. And that goes for any sort of art, murals or sculptures of prairie. It breeds familiarity, which breeds affection. And so I think one way that we can help others gain even more appreciation of the prairie is documenting prairie in winter. Those dead stalks that maybe people don't really like, but it's actually one of my favorite things about the prairie is the prairie in the winter. That tan, dead color, it really does bring comfort for me.
So as an artist, what do you notice when you're out in the winter? This wasn't one of our original questions, but I guess what do you notice in the winter about the prairie that makes it something that's kind of a beautiful landscape for you?
I really like to see just a few stalks of grass sticking out of like perfect, fresh, fluffy snow. Or the image of some seeds that were just spread on top of the snow. There's also just like the sparkling and the glittering that comes from frost on plants. Recently we just had an ice storm that leveled our prairies, but you can find thick drops of ice on a stalk of bergamot that are just, they look out of this world almost. And I think that's just really fantastic.
We have asked many of our guests about their relationship with the prairie by asking which of the following came first, affection or attention. So really what we're driving at there, I guess, is did you always have a love of the prairie and then cultivate that and develop that more through paying closer attention as an artist and a biologist? Mm-hmm. Or was it through paying close attention as an artist and a biologist that you've developed an affection for the prairie?
I would say I learned to love it after paying really close attention. Kind of goes back to that prairie smoke example. My first impression of it was, this is weird looking. It's measly and I don't know about it, you know? But as I was made to learn about it, it becomes the most fascinating thing that there is. Also, hopping back to the hyssop, the Anise hyssop, that's one of the first prairie plants I was ever introduced to as, I believe, a third grader on a field trip to the MSUM Regional Science Center. Our guide, which could have even been Dr. Allison Wallace now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure. But they showed us the hyssop. They told us, smell it. It smells like black licorice. And I've always remembered that. And I didn't make the connection on the name of the plant until this spring when I purchased it from John.
You know, there's a lot of people that can do postcards of rivers and mountains. what is it about the prairie that is like a kind of challenge to get people immediately to say, I love the prairie? Can you think of?
I think a challenge in this day and age is that what people think is prairie may be a degraded ecosystem that is lacking actual prairie plants. So you may go to a field and say, what is this? And it's a brome field, and so that's why it's not exciting. If it were full of 100 species that were supposed to be there, it may be easier to make that connection.
What tips do you have for listeners who maybe want to support native prairie restoration efforts here in the Northern Great Plains, or who want to plant something like a pollinator garden or a prairie planting in their yard, farmstead, or local community?
I may commission John for help on some of this answer.
Sure.
But I think the most important part, if possible, is to get your plants locally sourced. So in North Dakota, we serve the eastern portion of North Dakota and the western portion of Minnesota. Further west, into North Dakota, we aren't really aware of sources for local ecotype gardens out there. What you could start to do is look for remnant patches. Get permission to plant or to pick seed from them. But it gets really tricky because, as I've mentioned earlier, in order to get seed from some species, you need to have it burned. It needs to have been burned that year or the year before. And so it's really hard. Just honestly, it's really difficult. Wherever you get your plants from, if you're trying to make a prairie garden, you need to plant them very dense together. You can't have them spaced 2 feet apart. You need to have at least 2 plants in the same square foot, because as I had mentioned with that, the roots that I pulled out of that 4-year-old planting, that was 2 species in the same square inch. That's how a prairie really is. It's incredibly diverse, and plants are always competing, and that's why they're small, because they're always competing. Plant density, diversity is key. Talk about your bloom periods. Your golden alexanders bloom early. Your large beard tongue blooms early. Late in the season, you have your sunflowers and your asters. Midsummer, you have all of your milkweed, your oxeye sunflowers, and countless other species. So if you're making a prairie garden or a prairie planting, boost your diversity. Include grasses, but not only grasses. You need a lot of forbs for the pollinators and the birds and everything that eats those things.
If you were to make a bouquet of native prairie plants, as an artist, I wanted to ask you this. What species would you include and why? And you're welcome to include grasses as well as flowers here.
Mm-hmm. So we actually did make native plant bouquets for our free will feed this last summer. We had about 12 bouquets. We made them identical and put them on all the tables in our brand new community center to bring some life into the brand new white building. But personally, my bouquet would have Indian grass. When it's gone to seed, the seed head is just so soft, and I love the color of it. Another species I would have is golden alexanders, but specifically when they turn red in the fall and they've started senescing, and their seed heads are there and still intact. I would also have native sunflowers like Maximilian sunflower, showy sunflower. I would have little blue stem, the grass. I would have prairie liatris for its tall, long bloom. I would have New England asters. They're a kind of a weird color of pink, purple that It's kind of the only plant I've seen that has that color. Maybe phlox has that color, but that's a spring plant. I would also have white sage for the scent and the different colors that can be seen then. And so this bouquet would be a fall bouquet that you would pick in probably early September.
What life lessons have you learned from the prairie? So here I've been inspired in a lot of ways by my PhD is in American Indian literature and indigenous literatures. So I'm not native, but that was something that was important to me to really kind of learn from the original and ongoing inhabitants of the place that I call home. And in that way, thinking of land not as property or real estate, but as teacher, as home. So in that spirit, I'm curious what kind of life lessons you've learned from the prairie. And so if it were the teacher, what is it trying to teach you? And maybe what are you still learning from it?
I'd say that prairie has taught me to be happy and overjoyed with the flat landscape that we call home on the prairie here. Part of it is because you can see the whole sky and the sunsets are the best here. And when you look closely at a real prairie, it's not simple and it's not flat. There are depressions from buffalo. There are small wetlands, there are ditches that humans have made that still add diversity to the landscape. The prairie really teaches patience, though. It gives us a reason to get through the winter, to see what plants are going to bloom this year. We planted it 4 years ago, and this year we burned it, and now what's going to be there? So it makes you stick around for the winter. It really does. So I've learned to just appreciate home, and that I can travel anywhere. I can see mountain ranges. I could go look at rainforests. But what's right here at home is what needs help. And we need people that are from here to be doing that work, learning the plants and listening to the prairie. And I'm still learning how to do that. But I think we're on the right track here at United Prairie Foundation.
In the coolers here we have, maybe we'll just show you. Okay, so as a lot of what we do is we use real prairie plants, and we have, I'm just going to guess, 50 acres and 80 acres, somewhere in there, in plots that we've planted. We have two in town that are actually in town here that we can dig bare root plants out of. We grow some bare root plants in production to be able to use, but we really use them out of our planted prairies. There's so many plants growing that when we go remove a couple thousand, you'll never know it. We'll store plants in the cold storage. For instance, like these. This is one big blue stem plant. This is all cold, moist, stratified, so they'll germinate.
I think it's a showy goldenrod.
Okay, a showy goldenrod. That's, I don't know, maybe a year or two old. So we've dug this out. It never got processed. We ran out of time. But this gets planted in the spring, and you're getting a plant that is multi-years old. So is what we use these for is in really high-profile areas. So if we're going to do a garden at a city hall or some high-traffic park area, we would try to get really established prairie plants growing. That way we can give a greater representation to the public. We don't want them to come by and, their first experience with prairie better be positive, or else you're going to lose. If you come in and say, well, come back in 4 years and you'll see it. Yeah, right. They have already formed their opinion when they've looked at it. So our vision is if we can create these really high quality, nice prairies right off the bat, that you'll get more buy-in from the community, the people. And that's really what we need, because the culture isn't prairie. We got to change that culture. And I think people now are more open to the change than maybe they were, because it was just
Yeah.
You know, 2 generations ago, they were planting the brome and Kentucky bluegrass and thinking every one of these plants were weeds. But the best understanding or the way to understand is that when you look at like I mentioned earlier, that how the buffalo sustained on the North American prairies, that the difference between buffaloes and cattle preferred to eat the wildflowers, whereas buffalo preferred to eat the grass. And so when they managed for cattle at the early times with the brome and Kentucky bluegrass, and they came up with herbicides that they could spray and keep your fields clean, now you got all grass. You don't have to worry about all the weeds out there. So most of the weeds at that time were native prairie plants and were preferred by the cattle. So when they just continuously grazed pastures for cattle, they were targeting the wildflowers. So you can only nip a wildflower like this to the dirt so much and it's gone. It needs to be able to grow and, you know, to be able to refreshen the root reserves. So if you're continuously grazing, it keeps nipping down the prairie plants that they like, they're gone. So you're left in pastures with plants that they didn't like, the vervains and some of the goldenrods. And those are the weeds of the past. Oh, those prairie plants are weeds. Yeah, but that's like 4 species out of the 400 that could be growing in your pasture. So that's where fire comes into play, because fire would have been, like buffalo would have been eating on fire every year. They would never eat in second, third year. Fire hadn't been there for 5 years. You're not going to find the buffalo there for the summer. They're going to migrate to somewhere that fire was. And so the cattle are same, that you can distribute them through a patch burn grazing like that. And so fire is the biggest key. No fire, no prairie. We could say that in every single segment of an interview, right? No fire, no prairie.
Yeah.
But that's true, you know.
What's the significance of fire to prairie? Can you describe that? Like why no fire, no prairie, and how do we bring fire back into play? Obviously there's natural ways with waiting for lightning strikes and things of that nature, but how can we bring fire back into play in a broader sense on the prairie, and why is it so significant?
Well, prairie is a fire-dependent ecosystem. Fires historically probably went through this region every 4 to 12 years. And that would happen when plants are dormant and dry. And if they weren't dormant, they would probably survive through the fire. They wouldn't burn. But what the fire does is it clears the dead plant material from the top, restores nutrients to the soil, and it exposes the bare dirt that warms the soil for new seeds to germinate, or the warm season grasses to grow in very lush. We've also found that for us to be able to collect a lot of seed, it needs to be off of a burned site, aside from some of these hay meadows. But you will find lower seed viability where a site wasn't burned. And so that really makes sense then when you look at a field or a ditch that hasn't been burned in 50 years, how is the prairie gone? You know, it's because there wasn't a fire. There was no
right.
New
It gives
seed.
the upper hand to the Kentucky bluegrass.
Yeah.
That somehow that can just go right over top of the prairie, and that's lack of fire. Some seeds, like she had mentioned, prairie drop seed. You go find remnant populations in ditches, and there's no viable seed. So those populations are dwindling. I mean, those plants are old. How old they are, no one really knows how old they are. They could be as old as oak trees, those particular plants. So, bringing fire back to the regime would keep things clean and growing and coming back.
You can hope for wildfires, but we also implement burns on our plantings as well.
Restoring fire to the ecosystem is going to keep the cattle on the land way more than not. It'll give them protection because they're grazing on non-native cool season grasses like your front yard. If you don't water it in the middle of summer, Kentucky bluegrass, it turns brown. I love it because I don't have to mow my yard. My neighbor mows my yard, but I just love it, man. So But that if you're a cattle producer, you'd be bumming out. You'd be stressing a little bit because what your cows are really dependent on eating that. And that's really came on in the last 30 years is the dominance of Kentucky bluegrass in these ecosystems, hence the Meadowlark Initiative. All of a sudden it goes boom. Now it got to that point that the forefathers were really envisioning, oh, when the whole world is Kentucky bluegrass, it'll be so good. But they didn't realize they're not in Europe. They're in the northern plains, and it gets 100 and something degrees, dry, and these plants are rooted a couple inches deep is all. They're not able to sustain. They turn brown and go dormant. Well, if your cattle are dependent on that and you're dependent on making hay off all that stuff, and you're selling your cows. And that's bad for grassland bird people because it gets so easily, the farm makes that decision to put it in the soybeans or some other row crop a lot easier than when we need to rebuild our cattle herd again. Well, didn't we just do this a few years ago? Yeah, but we got to do it again. And pretty soon they just say, forget it. So, but that doesn't need to happen. If it was a diverse, managed landscape, they wouldn't have to sell their cows. But that's the culture. The culture isn't what I'm talking about. But they're starting to see this. So that's really the key to it is getting it to where we can, a good ecosystem that supports North American birds supports North American cattle also. That's the key.
I was going to say, I'm on the fire department up there, volunteer.
Nice.
And this makes me want to go back there and say we need to start helping out with prairie burns.
Right.
And it'd be good training for us.
It used to be back in our leader is Mr. Larry Hansen, retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife out of Detroit Lakes. He was a burn boss, and in the early days of doing RX fire through the state of Minnesota, they used the Fish and Wildlife used to employ the rural fire departments. They would kick cash back to the rural fire departments, and they were an integral part of it. Now that's completely gone away. The whole methodology of burning is going away, and that's really sad because the more people you can engage in the management, the better off you are. Biggest problem that we see on the landscape is the lack of real prairie seed and the cost of it to do it because it's rare. It isn't super abundant. It's how people hand collecting to get these really diverse mixes. There's other nonprofits out there that have done it for their land, but to get it like the programs to get it to where you're doing large scale, like we run 2 combines that we have. We combine, typically we combine somewhere between 2 and 8 native prairies in a year for our seed mixes. And so that's really would be the limiting factors in the quality of seed. But even utilizing some commercial mixes, it would be implementing the fire part of it, putting it in the patch burn graze, and that's breaking down the cultural barriers because cattle alone don't do nothing for doing it. They're a byproduct of a well-managed grassland. They're not the management for a grasslands, and that's something you got to really break down the barriers of. So we're working on some programs that we'll have in the future. NDSU's done some really good research on some stuff, and it just is the future is dependent on figuring out how to get prairie on the ground. And us as a small nonprofit, that's what we do. I mean, our mission is to making prairie common again.
Do you guys do a lot of education outreach with young people, teaching them how to collect seeds, or is that something you're looking to expand in any way? Or
Well, we employ a lot of young people in this area. There's quite a few high school aged and college age employees that we have that I think are just incredibly lucky to be in their position, to be able to learn this stuff and be doing the real work on the ground before they've even started their career. So they
we have a great staff.
Yeah, they're really awesome. I remember I started here. I'm 27. I started here. I was like, these girls are 17. I didn't even know a native plant when I was 17. I don't know. I think it's really amazing. And more public outreach is a goal of ours too.
But we're putting together that program. You were just writing on it today on the development.
Yeah, we're putting
of it,
things together.
right?
So.
Because we have a program that was funded by the trust, the North Dakota Natural Resources and Trust. They're a great organization. They have a small grants program that tries to stimulate projects to make the natural resources better, to reach out. And we've been lucky enough to gain one of those grants to do an outreach event out of our new community center. We're right now in our old one, but we have a brand new community center down the street, and the base of it is Beetle Fest, and it's what it is it's biological and plant diversity control for weed management in grasslands. You cannot use herbicides on grasslands and restore prairie. You just can't. The two doesn't go together. And when you realize that cattle would rather eat forbs than grass, then you really know, because when you're spraying grass to make grass, you're killing all the broadleaf plants, which is the preferred food for the cattle. So if you use biological control and plant diversity to beat the weeds in a long run environment, you're going to win, and you're going to have a healthier cattle deal. And so we've been funded by the trust to put a free will feed on to support the cattle industry. And for the last 3 years, we've sent the 4-H crew to Medora, North Dakota, to gather the correct type of spurge beetles that we've released in multiple. Generally, we release them in properties that landowners had given us permission to pick remnant prairie on. And so we've done that program for 3 years now, and this year we'll be collecting locally and expanding that footprint.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast. We'd like to extend a big thanks to John and Patrice and everyone at the United Prairie Foundation for their remarkable work here in the Northern Great Plains. The United Prairie Foundation has inspired us to start our own native seed collection program here in Walsh County, in partnership with a local high school and with generous guidance and support from the United Prairie Foundation. We have included links to the UPF website and to Patrice's book, Under Mother Tree, in the show notes. Special thanks to Matthew Connolly for producing our theme music and to Crista Fiala for producing today's episode. Until next time, this is Josh Anderson signing off for Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast. Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast, is supported by a generous grant from the North Dakota Natural Resources Trust. If you would like to contribute to our on-the-ground conservation initiatives and our conservation internship and mentorship programs here in North Dakota, please consider making a donation to us through our member support link on our Spotify page. Your contributions will directly support the Walsh County Three Rivers Soil Conservation District, where this year we will plant over 10,000 trees and several hundred acres of conservation grass, pollinators, and cover crops, while also offering hands-on conservation job training to our high school and college interns. You can also support our efforts by liking, reviewing, sharing, and subscribing to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Thank you.